Okay, so what the heck is going on here right now? Because we can talk about the game, right? We absolutely can. On the offensive side of the ball, turnovers for the Colts continue to be a problem for this team. Doesn't matter who's playing quarterback. The running game, inconsistent both in how effective it is and our commitment to it throughout the course of a given game. We're always running out of the shotgun. I don't understand it. Jonathan Taylor is a downhill runner. Why not get under center and let him get a head start into the run? He's not a lateral runner like that. I mean, if you think back, do you remember when DeMarco Murray went from the Cowboys to the Tennessee Titans? And with the Cowboys, they were always under center with Tony Romo, and they would always hand it under center and then go from there. And then he went to the Titans, and he was nowhere near as effective. And ultimately, the conclusion everyone came to was the fact that, well, running out of the shotgun isn't quite the same thing as running from under center. Like, you have running backs with two different types of skill sets. And sure, we see Jonathan Taylor break runs because that's what he does. But ultimately, it was kind of feast or famine. It was either you break 30, 40, 50 yards, or you're kind of just stopped at the line of scrimmage. It just doesn't seem like we're doing a whole lot to make sure that Jonathan Taylor is a factor throughout the course of the entire game. And on the positive side, it's nice to see Adonai Mitchell out there making some catches and, kind of finally having a game where he looks like, okay, you could see something out of him. You could see a future from him as an outside receiver in this league. As much as I liked him, it's been a whole bunch of nothing for most of the year from Adonai Mitchell, right? Mac Goncalves, Taylor Bordolini, nice to see them play admirably in relief of both Ryan Kelly and, Bernard Raymond, respectfully. On the defensive side of the ball, those poor guys doing all they possibly can for an offense that's doing them absolutely no favors whatsoever. I mean, the idea that they allowed 30 points, very, very deceiving. The idea of complementary football is one that is brought up very, very often. And the Colts right now are not doing it, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. That's a side of the ball that very much is dependent. Their energy is dependent on some level. And you listen, you could say that this is good, bad. It's really not my point. I'm not making like a judgment on it. I'm just kind of telling you what it is. Oftentimes on defense, their energy is dependent on the productivity of the offense. So if your offense is coming out there and putting up a stinker, man, it's hard for that defense to come out there and play good for all four quarters. But they were forcing turnovers and giving that offense plenty of opportunities, and you just weren't seeing anything. But ultimately, the game isn't even so much what we're focused on. You can't help but zoom out and just kind of look at the entire picture here for the Indianapolis Colts and say, something feels a little bit rotten here right now. Like something is not passing the smell test. And I mean, that's really all there is to it. And you don't want to overreact, right? Because you look and you say, okay, the Minnesota Vikings and the Buffalo Bills, ultimately that's what we're reacting to, right? The timeline is you bench Anthony Richardson, I think justifiably, based off his play. Now, whether or not it was the right move, seemingly as the weeks go by, it doesn't look great. But if you want to talk about whether or not it was justified, I think, everyone would have to concede there was at least a case to be made to do it, right? We went from that to the Vikings and the Bills, both of which are teams that were better than us with Richardson, without Richardson, and we lost those two games as we really kind of should have in the grand scheme of things, right? When we talk about judging the team as a whole. So you don't want to overreact to those types of things. But at the same time, after this game, you got Julian Blackmon and Kenny Moore just coming out here and really having some choice words about the team. While I'm pulling up Julian Blackmon's actual quote, Kenny Moore was the one that was on video, so I think a lot more people saw it, where he said essentially he doesn't think everyone's working as hard as they could, and it's aggravating to see them make the same mistakes over and over again. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but you could go ahead and look it up for yourself. Look up Kenny Moore after the game. I mean, the clip's everywhere. And as for Julian Blackmon, I want to read it because really it is kind of alarming stuff to hear from two pretty, important players, to say the least, not just to the defensive side of the ball, but to this team as a whole. There's Julian Blackmon, okay? This is a quote. I'm reading directly. From my standpoint, I feel like it's hard for me to call out names or anything like that. but there's definitely more than what meets the eye. It definitely bleeds over to what happens in games. You see the same things in practice that we see on Sundays, and it's no surprise, but it's frustrating. It's frustrating to be a defense that takes the ball away, do everything that we can, but that's what we signed up for. We've got to continue to try to do that, figure out an identity that we believe in as a team in order to turn this thing around. Now, listen, am I a huge fan of him essentially throwing the offense under the bus, quite frankly? No. Particularly when every time this offense does well, the defense ultimately ends up making things way more difficult than they have to be. So the defense is talking like they've been the greatest thing since sliced bread all season. So I don't love that, but that doesn't change the fact that what they're saying is what they're saying, okay? And even DeForest Buckner, who's as classy as, and he would never. But if you look at the locker room talk after the game, if you ever watch that for the Colts, it's just kind of a series of guys getting interviewed by their lockers. Even DeForest Buckner, he didn't say anything directly, but he was almost bewildered. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw it. If you did, you know what I'm talking about. You just saw it. He didn't want to say anything. But my point, again, I bring this up, something ain't right. The question is, who exactly are they talking about? When you say, Kenny Moore says that people aren't working hard enough, and Julian Blackmon clearly, even if indirectly, points his finger to the offense, who are they talking about, right? Because that's the million-dollar question. It feels a little bit deeper than the offensive unit as a whole, at least in terms of the statements being made, because you have Julian Blackmon saying, I don't want to say names, and Kenny Moore saying not everyone is working as hard as they could. So it's not just a unit thing, it doesn't feel like. It feels like they're talking about maybe an individual or a set of individuals. I mean, you know, we're going to talk about that because you could only assume that there's a few options there. There's only so many options that they would be talking about. And that's what we're going to try to ponder a little bit. But things right now for the Indianapolis Colts, just not only, it's one thing to look, right? It's one thing to lose games, but something here feels amiss. Something is not passing the smell test. Like, are we on the same page, guys? Are we on the same page about that? We're going to talk about it. But before we do, you know what it is. My name is Justin. This right here is the Ride on the Bench Colts podcast. As always, I ask anyone watching on YouTube and enjoying the show, go ahead, shoot it a like. It's going to help me get out to as many Colts fans as humanly possible. Of course, subscribe if you want to be a part of the journey. On the trek to 3,000, we hope to get there by the end of the season. Audio listeners, leave a five-star review. And again, now we'll talk, right? Now we'll talk. So we're going to start on the Shane Steichen side of things, okay? Because we can talk about Anthony Richardson and his poor play, which it absolutely was. And we can talk about Joe Flacco and his poor play, which it absolutely is. The one constant in those two things is Shane Steichen himself. And one of the issues, I mean, this offense has had a litany of issues this year, okay? You want to talk about time of possession? We've had a problem there. We keep losing the turnover battle. We have way too many 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8 type of situations. Like, that's just not a recipe for success in the NFL. You know, converting in third downs is one of the things that you could look at. Without even looking at the score, there are certain things you could look at in a game and kind of determine whether or not a team wins the football game. And the Colts are losing all of them. As I said, time of possession, third down conversions, and the turnover battle. The Colts generally losing all three of those things, or at least, I have no stats, but, you know, you don't exactly have to be a rocket scientist to call out what you're looking at, okay? They're losing all those battles consistently. There's just nothing here. There's nothing here. You're not going to win games playing offense like the Colts are. And even in a season like last year, inconsistency in the running game isn't exactly a topic that has just started this year. Sure, we ran the ball very well last year, but there were kind of times where we were like, where's JT? And I understand he was hurt a little bit, right? And we chalked it up to that. But just inconsistencies in the effort and the commitment to run the football seem to be kind of a common theme since Steichen started. And everyone knows that watches this channel, I've been a huge fan, a huge supporter. I'm not jumping off the cliff yet, but we kind of call a spade here. You know, it's possible too, right? Because, I mean, how can last year be so impressive on the offensive side of the ball and this year be this? It's possible we don't have a quarterback that can play, okay? That's a very realistic possibility here because I'm having a tough time wrapping around how things seemingly on the offensive side of the ball, because you could look at a team in the record overall and say, okay, we're still kind of a middling 500 team, but on the offensive side of the ball, things have gotten worse for the Indianapolis Colts this year. And quite frankly, there is no reason to believe that they should have. So that right there is where I'm a little confused right now. I'm a little, I don't know. You went right when we left the game. What was the game? Who did we actually play? It was the Texans, right? Who just picked off Jared Goff 5 times. I mean, you look at the Texans and kind of quarterbacks and the way they've played against them throughout the course of the year. It's not to excuse Anthony Richardson's 10 of 32 by any means, but you look and say, not for anything, that defense has been putting together some really, really, really good work against opposing passing games. But after that game, in the post-game presser, Shane Steichen, when asked about who was starting at quarterback, because remember, his answer to that was always Anthony's the guy, Anthony's the guy, Anthony's the guy. And it wasn't until that day where he said, we're evaluating everything right now. And in that moment, you realized that, wow, something has changed. And what I wonder is why is he so steadfast on Flacco even now after those 2 games? Because if the belief, which was at least reasonable in the sense, right? People could say that the Colts had no chance of winning anything real, and that's likely true. But I don't think there's technically a bad thing with trying to make the playoffs. Like, if you think you have a shot to make the playoffs, I don't think there's anything wrong, even in a season where you don't feel like you're going to win the Super Bowl, trying to go make the playoffs. I mean, you can't want to win, but then also fault that. So I'm not really against that. But if the thought was that Joe Flacco gave you the best chance to win it, and presumably it was going to be because he protected the football and moved the offense consistently, well, past these past 2 games, he has not done that at all. So when you face the reality of that situation, knowing that Joe Flacco has not been a starting quarterback since he was with the Baltimore Ravens in terms of being trusted to be one, sure, he was for the Broncos for a second, but ultimately that ended for a reason. When you face that reality, you can't help but think to yourself, why is Shane Steichen so steadfast on calling Joe Flacco the starter moving forward even now? Do they really think that lowly of Anthony Richardson? Is it Shane Steichen literally just being stubborn? Does he feel stupid now if he were to admit he's wrong and go back? Like, it just feels like there's something that we're not being told. Does it have to do with Chris Ballard? Is he trying to protect his job? Is Shane Steichen just a puppet on the strings? Again, there's a few possibilities, but you just don't know what it is. But then you hear guys like Julian Blackmon and Kenny Moore kind of imply this idea that not everyone is doing their job here. And, you know, is the team losing faith in Shane Steichen, or are they just emotional? You don't know. You don't know. But the common theme that I'm going to keep trying to say to you throughout this episode is something isn't right here. Like, something doesn't feel right. And it's just, it's one thing to lose. It's another thing for it to be like this. Now, if they're talking about Shane Steichen, I mean, that's the worst case scenario, in my opinion, because now you're talking about a guy in a head, right? Because you look at Chris Ballard right now. Listen, I've defended him long and hard. Pause. It is hard right now to support Chris Ballard at all. And the arrogance of him, which I've always admitted is a thing where it's just kind of like, there's an arrogance to a Chris Ballard. And I'm getting a little off topic, but I mean, are the Colts on the verge of a full reset here? Like, if this season continues as it's going, and it seems to be headed in the wrong direction, and we'll see if they could turn it around. Ultimately, we still have 7 games to play here, and we don't know how they're going to go, so I want to be fair. But if things were to continue looking like this, is it just clear house? I mean, and I'm the last guy to suggest it, but it doesn't feel right. Now, if they're talking about guys not working hard to try to get back on topic, is it Joe Flacco? Like, is there a world where Flacco signed with the Indianapolis Colts and never really had desire to be a starter? Where he was kind of like, okay, I'm 40 years old, and sure, I would like to start. I don't have a problem starting. Go ahead. I like playing football. That's why I'm still here. But also, like, is he not exactly motivated? Like, everyone's motivated, right? They're in the NFL. So I'm not going to sit here and say, like, he's just, just completely checked out. But is he not motivated in the sense where it's like he feels like he has nothing to prove at this point in his career? Like, there's not like a level of hunger that contributes to doing all of the extra things. I mean, Kenny Moore talking about details and saying it's not translating from meetings to the practice field to the game field. Like, does that have something to do with the fact that, like, maybe Joe Flacco just doesn't have that fire in the pit of his stomach that he once had? We're in pure speculation land right now because something seems like we're just not being told something right now in Indianapolis. And the lack of transparency, seemingly, that we're getting is something that has been now consistent for really Ballard's entire reign. So as much as I want to talk about Steichen here, and as much as we could talk about Flacco, you kind of look and say, well, okay, is this just like a Ballard issue, right? Well, it is a Ballard issue, but are the players talking about Ballard? I also find that hard to believe because when we talk about Ballard not working hard enough, we're saying he's not working hard enough to bring in talent. So if you're a player and you're saying Ballard's not working hard enough, you're essentially incriminating yourself, right? Because part of what he was supposed to do was have better players than you, okay? So it's just hard to know what exactly is going on. I come here with only questions and no answers. But I'm just curious, when you hear, and really that's my big takeaway, when you hear Julian Blackmon and Kenny Moore say things like that, do you think they're talking about Steichen? Like, who do you think it is that they're talking about? Do you think it's just the fact that they're looking at the team as a whole and looking at the temperature of things and saying, hey, guys are giving up here? Because, you know, Julian Blackmon, I'm going to keep going. Julian Blackmon saying that, okay, we're seeing it on the practice field, so it's no surprise, and we're seeing it on game day. So we're seeing the same things in practice that we're seeing on game day. Well, my experience, if I'm to speak to that, going to training camp, number one, last year, I thought the offense was very impressive. When I went this year, my biggest takeaway was that the defense was winning the battle, and I chalked that up to the defense being better than we thought it was. You know, maybe in hindsight, not maybe, clearly in hindsight, it was that there's a defect in the offense. But is that Shane Steichen? Or is it the fact that we don't have a quarterback who's ready to come out here and lead this team? Or is it none of the above? I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you think, but we got the Jets coming up this week. I'm going to that game. And then we have the Detroit Lions, which is going to be a real test for the Indianapolis Colts because the Detroit Lions don't come out and take it easy on anyone. So, well, maybe you're in a game where a team like the Bills, let's say, is playing down to their competition. The Detroit Lions are not going to come out and do that. So these next 2 weeks are going to be a good test and a gut check as to kind of where this Colts team is at. Because it doesn't seem like they've given up, but it also, again, just feels like something is happening. It feels like something is wrong, and it feels, once again, like there is something that us as fans are not being told, which I understand we can't know everything, but it's an overwhelming feeling of that. And it's just something we've come too used to, being fans of this team. So I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts. I want to hear your thoughts specifically on this, if I'm to make an ask, if you've made it this far. Specifically on the comments of Kenny Moore and Julian Blackmon. Who the hell do you think they're talking about? And we'll talk about it in the comment section. But until next time, my name is Justin. This right here was the Ride on the Bench Colts podcast. And as always, my goodness, go Colts.